There was a time when justice wasn't hidden behind courtroom walls. It stood in the center of cities, surrounded by crowds, ritual, and symbolism. Some methods weren't designed for speed. They were designed to send a message that lasted generations. But as we uncover the most haunting execution practices in history, one question keeps returning. Were these methods about fear, fate, or something far more psychological? The deeper we go into the past, the more we realize the real story isn't about how people were punished. It's about how societies chose to remember. Before we uncover what history tried to hide, subscribe to Unseen Evidence, because some truths were never meant to be found, and tell me where you're watching this from. I'm curious to know. Let's continue. History rarely speaks loudly at first. It begins with whispers carried through time, passing from one generation to another until stories become shadows that linger at the edge of memory. And among those shadows are the ways societies chose to enforce order, to define justice, and to shape fear into something tangible. Because long before modern courts and written rights, people believed that punishment was not only a response to wrongdoing, but a performance meant to remind everyone watching where power lived and how fragile safety could be. And if you listen carefully to the echoes of ancient streets, you might almost hear the quiet footsteps of crowds gathering, not always in anger or excitement, but often in solemn curiosity, because execution in many eras was not chaos but ritual, carefully structured, symbolic, and designed to leave an impression deeper than words could ever reach. And the most unsettling truth is that many methods were created less for efficiency and more for meaning, turning justice into something theatrical, where every detail carried psychological weight, where the environment itself became part of the message, where silence could be louder than screams, and across continents, rulers discovered that fear did not need constant reinforcement if it was unforgettable enough once, so they crafted methods that felt inevitable, almost mythical, something people spoke about in hushed tones long after the moment had passed. And in medieval towns, the execution square was often placed at the heart of daily life, near markets or churches, where ordinary routines collided with the extraordinary reminder that laws were not abstract ideas but forces capable of reshaping lives instantly. Yet the eerie element was rarely the act itself, but the anticipation surrounding it, because waiting transforms imagination into its own storyteller, and records suggest that many individuals experienced days or weeks of uncertainty before judgment was carried out, time stretching into something heavy and intangible, a psychological space where reality blurred with fear. And this manipulation of time reveals how societies understood human emotion even without modern psychology, understanding that anticipation could change behavior more effectively than action. And in some ancient cultures, judgment was handed to natural forces, rivers or elements believed to possess divine authority. And these rituals reveal a fascinating paradox, because rather than placing responsibility solely on human hands, communities sometimes shifted it toward fate, turning execution into a dialogue between humanity and the cosmos, a belief that nature itself would decide truth. And for observers, this was not seen as random but sacred, reinforcing the idea that justice existed beyond individual rulers. And as civilizations grew more complex, methods evolved alongside technology, reflecting advances in engineering and architecture, creating structures that stood as constant reminders of authority, silent monuments that required no explanation because their presence alone shaped behavior, and people walking past them daily would internalize the message without needing to witness anything firsthand, illustrating how psychological deterrence became as important as physical enforcement. And over time, different regions developed practices rooted deeply in cultural symbolism, some focusing on purification or restoration of balance rather than punishment alone, others emphasizing public acknowledgement of wrongdoing as a path toward collective healing, revealing that execution methods often reflected spiritual or philosophical beliefs more than simple cruelty. And yet, regardless of culture, one pattern appears repeatedly: the importance of witnesses, because crowds transformed individual moments into shared narratives, turning justice into a collective memory that influenced how future generations understood authority. And storytelling became inseparable from punishment itself, because once an event entered local folklore, it shaped behavior long after the physical structure or ritual disappeared, and there is something deeply unsettling about how memory amplifies fear, because people rarely remember precise details, instead recalling atmosphere, tension, and the emotional weight of the moment, and rulers understood this instinctively, crafting experiences designed to linger in imagination rather than fade quickly. But history also records moments when spectacle failed, when audiences responded with sympathy instead of obedience, revealing that human empathy could disrupt even carefully planned displays of power. And these moments often triggered shifts toward quieter forms of justice, moving punishment away from public squares into more private spaces, a transformation that raises philosophical questions about whether unseen justice carries the same authority as visible justice. And as executions moved behind walls, the relationship between society and punishment changed, creating distance that both reduced spectacle and introduced new forms of uncertainty. Because what happens when citizens no longer witness the mechanisms of law directly, and thus mystery strengthen or weaken trust. And as centuries passed, debates intensified, with philosophers questioning whether fear truly produced stability or merely silence. And these debates influenced reforms that reshaped legal systems gradually, not through sudden revolution, but through countless small changes guided by evolving moral frameworks. And yet, even as societies claimed to become more humane, the shadow of earlier methods remained embedded in cultural memory, appearing in literature, art, and whispered stories told across generations, because humans are drawn to the edge of fear, seeking to understand what lies just beyond comfort. And dark history channels into that instinct, exploring how our ancestors confronted chaos and sought control through ritualized responses. And when examining historical execution practices without sensationalism, we uncover deeper truths about human psychology, revealing how societies use symbolism to reinforce identity, how fear can unify or divide communities, and how justice has always been shaped by cultural context rather than universal agreement. And perhaps the most haunting aspect is recognizing that each era believed its methods were justified by necessity, convinced that stability required certain sacrifices. And this realization invites reflection on modern assumptions, encouraging us to question which practices today might appear equally strange or troubling to future generations, because history does not simply judge the past, it mirrors the present. And by exploring these stories, we confront timeless dilemmas about authority, morality, and the human need for order. And throughout history, people have struggled to balance compassion with control, attempting to create systems that prevent chaos while preserving dignity. And the tension between these goals continues to shape legal systems around the world, reminding us that justice is never static but constantly evolving. And perhaps the most chilling lesson is not about specific methods at all, but about how easily societies normalize practices when they align with prevailing beliefs, showing how culture shapes perception, how rituals transform fear into meaning, and how the quiet acceptance of a system can make even extraordinary actions feel ordinary. And as you follow the path of history deeper, you begin to notice that many execution practices shared a common feature: ceremony, because ceremony transforms events into symbols, framing them within narratives that justify their existence. And whether through music, clothing, architecture, or spoken declarations, these rituals reinforce legitimacy, turning punishment into something larger than individual judgment. And yet beneath the formal structure existed individuals, observers, officials, and communities, all navigating their own emotional responses, some feeling reassurance, others unease. And this mixture of reactions reveals that history is never a single voice, but a chorus of perspectives layered upon each other. And as societies transitioned toward modernity, the emphasis shifted from public demonstration to legal procedure, from symbolic theater to administrative process, reflecting a broader cultural move toward rationalization. And yet the eerie atmosphere never fully disappeared because the underlying questions remained unresolved. How should justice be defined? Who has authority to enforce it? And where is the boundary between deterrence and humanity? And perhaps this is why stories of historical execution methods continue to captivate audiences today, not because of shock value, but because they force us to confront the darker corners of human creativity and belief, reminding us that progress is rarely linear, and that each generation must grapple with inherited systems while imagining alternatives. And as we reach the end of this journey through shadowed corridors of history, we realize that the true horror lies not in the methods themselves, but in the realization that they were created by ordinary people, responding to extraordinary fears, shaping systems they believed necessary, leaving behind echoes that continue to challenge our understanding of justice and morality. And in that lingering silence, we are left with questions rather than answers. Questions that invite reflection rather than judgment, because history does not demand condemnation or celebration, only understanding. And perhaps by listening carefully to these stories, we gain insight not only into the past, but into ourselves, recognizing that the search for justice is ultimately a search for balance between power and compassion, between fear and hope, between control and freedom, and that search continues, quietly, endlessly, shaping the world even now.